Welcome to Beatle Blethers with Gerry and Alan. Recording in progress. Fantastic. Right, folks, welcome to our first visual Beatle Blether, and we're delighted to have a very visually appealing guest with us to start us off, which is G.R. Moores, who is the author of this superb book about Paul McCartney's career in the 1990s, which is an oft overlooked period of Paul's output. And we're hoping to chat about all things Paul, really, but particularly his kind of rise and fall as far as, you know, cultural cachet is concerned, and his experimental side, and anything else that you'd like to chat about.
Yeah,
GR. So very warm welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
yeah,
and I thank you very much for thanks for the invitation. You know,
well, thank you. We both read this book, you know, properly. We bought it when it came out, and were enthused by it. And if we're at peak McCartney now, you know, maybe peak McCartney post the Beatles, clearly this has been a mountain that, you know, there's been different heights and lows. And to get to when Paul became cool, or his, you know, how he's been reclaimed, we have to sort of start with, well, we have to start with the lows, don't we? And it wasn't always this bright and breezy for Paul, was it? Some of us grew up with Paul being pasted all over the place.
Yeah.
I don't know whether anyone in sort of 1980s was imagining that he would be headlining Glastonbury in his 80s in the very distant year of, what was it, 2022?
Yeah.
And I mean, I thought the 90s would be an interesting decade to zone in on, basically, because it hasn't been done so much. And I, to give a bit of background, so I had my previous book, Electric Wizards, which was about heavy music, sort of kicked off talking about Helter Skelter and how important that was in terms of influencing heavy metal, and you know, it's got echoes in various other heavy bits of music for much further down the line. So I was thinking about Paul McCartney quite a lot, and having attributed heavy music to him through Helter Skelter as the principal person behind Helter Skelter. And you know, as we do, we go through these periods where we're thinking about Paul McCartney quite a lot. You know, I'm sure you're the same. And it struck me, like I was reading different biographies and things, and it struck me that a lot of the biographies, and I realised there was a reason for this, but about 3/4 of them are in the 1960s, aren't they? And then you get this bit at the end, few chapters at the end where they go, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he did that, and it's as I say, I understand it, but it kind of does a disservice, doesn't it, to this guy that's had an outrageously long, successful, and up and down career. And then,
just to say the Philip Norman biography is astounding on that, isn't it? It's like a huge book, and then there's like this tiny little bit on like 1970 onwards.
Yeah, but even, you know, many years from now, the official, you know, Barry Miles Paul one is like that as well.
Which was presumably Paul's own desire, because that was kind of authorized, that one, wasn't it? The closest we'll get.
So
he recognizes what the audience wants. I'm cross at the critics for it, because it took me years to get round to Wings. In fact, I didn't really start exploring them till lockdown, I think, because I had just sort of believed the received wisdom that, you know, that was the unfortunate, we'll brush that under the carpet. And, you know, he's done the odd decent song. But then, you know, once you start exploring it album by album, and the level of invention and the level of just sheer delight, you know, in those albums.
You know, there were so many people who are massive Beatles fans that you talk to, and they have not explored anything like After Abbey Road, and you're thinking, what lack of curiosity is this?
Can I just say, I was there as a Wings fan, right? I was there charting that lonely course, and I think it comes from so being older than you two, my first adult memory, practically, of Understand the World, is the Beatles breaking up. I'm not, obviously don't really understand, but as a child, I'm thinking, why is this chap with this really nice face getting all this shit on him, you know? And so I'm a Paul person from then on in. It takes me a few years to get into music, Wings, you know. And I bought Venus and Mars and Speed of Sound about the same time I bought the Red and the Blue albums, but really the Wings albums are practically my ways into the Beatles. And then I buy London Town on the day of release, and then Back to the Egg. And I'm listening to these albums going, they're just so, okay, there's naff things in all these albums, but there's so much inventiveness and tunefulness and joy. And I also even didn't tell my school pals, because I'm into punk and new wave and disco and soul and all that. I didn't tell any of them at that point I was into Wings or even the Beatles, because they weren't cool. And McCartney was the leading, you know,
uncool one.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just a cultural cliche here, really. It's like.
So I'd also read Tom Doyle's Man on the Run. You know, the one.
Oh yeah, I read that. Yeah.
Focuses on the 70s, and I was just thinking, you know, like, well, why not focus on a different decade? And the 90s made sense to me, partly because of my age, getting into music like you and everything. But also I felt like, talking about him being uncool, you know, you can paint it quite easily as the 80s being his sort of credible low point, shall we say.
That's true.
The 90s being a time when he recovers from that, which fits nicely with the title Off the Ground, which makes a slightly better title than Flaming Pie, although I prefer Flaming Pie to Off the Ground. And it's like, as I think you were touching on before when we were chatting, like, it's not just about whatever Paul's doing. It's also, the book is about what else is going on in the wider culture that obviously impacts whether or not he's cool. And as you know, you sort of have Wings and punk, and then, I mean, a lot of people of his generation were not cool in the 80s, because that's how pop music works. You know, there's a backlash. There's other stuff that's more modern or for the kids. Stuff that's for the parents is rejected. It's, you know, it's partly this thing. Julian Cope has this quote, doesn't he, about you have to get through being a has-been before you become a legend. So it's sort of a natural thing that he's done as well.
Yeah, there's a natural art.
Yeah.
Let me ask you both this, because so there's the reaction about the pop stars in the 80s, and we can agree there were a lean 80s after a decent start in a way, you know, obviously McCartney 2 and all that, and even Tug of War, you know. But why was he so uncool? Because uncool through the 70s and the 80s, part of it's the breakup of the Beatles, but is it just that and him being blamed?
I do have a wee theory about the 80s, at least, and I think he just didn't know who he was trying to reach. He seems to have forgot. He didn't know who his audience was. And that's got to be partly because he wasn't really touring in the 80s post Wings. So I think he just lost touch with who, even in the 70s with his most egregious kind of self-indulgences, there was somebody out there who was going, yeah, Paul, that's a good one. Mary had a little lamb, man, yeah. But I think in the 80s, those folk had grown up, and the new generation had been kind of convinced by punk that the only way that was year zero, and anything that went before was kind of passé. But then in the 90s, John, I think your book demonstrates that he sort of began to remember what he was for, or remember who he spoke, who he was speaking to, and maybe that gave him a bit more direction in that decade.
Yeah, I think one of the problems in the 80s is that people or newer bands are sort of pretending that they don't like the Beatles, or not mentioning if they do like the Beatles. And the bands that are still going, we really like the Beatles, you know, who is it going to be? It's going to be like Jeff Lynne or whoever, you know, who are kind of naff, like versions of copying the Beatles or whatever, trying to keep the flame going, but in quite a sort of derivative way. And I think there's all, like, it's all tied up with like the John Lennon stuff as well, because he's martyred, isn't he? And he becomes rock and roll saint, and doesn't get the chance to become less and less cool. And one of the surprising things that I found when I was like doing my research was like just how harsh some of Lennon's obituaries were on Paul McCartney. Like that's the forum to kind of go on about who was cooler and edgier and safer and more sickly and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Terrible taste, just a really cruel approach.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think there's a really horrible one by Martin Amis, who says, he's going on about how great John Lennon was, and I think he says it. Paul McCartney just wanted to appeal to your grandmother and this kind of thing, and there's other ones in America as well that have a similar kind of.
Yeah.
I think there's one
Even if that was true.
One of the American ones even says, it's a shame it wasn't Paul who was shot instead.
A common stupid witticism, isn't it?
Yeah.
And of course, given the blancmange that Double Fantasy was, that it took, it wasn't well received, and then it becomes this revered piece, and then it's taken years for it to be seen as like, actually Yoko's stuff's more interesting on it, and Yoko's trajectory since and all that. But John's kind of saved, isn't he? Because he's saved an aspect by dying, whereas my take is, after some time in New York City, which is a fascinating, awful album, but it's fascinating, he never recovers. Paul McCartney at points has known who he was and forgotten who he was, or lost his way. John Lennon lost his way about 72, I think. And then he's saved by 69 to 71 becomes the Lennon, the peace campaigner. It's a very short period. And it's true of lots of great, rock and rollers that die at, relatively early ages. 40,
We need to blame John slightly for the critical attitude to Paul, because, and I'm sure he would have regretted that. I'm sure he did regret that, because in later 70s interviews, he was much, much more open to saying that, that they're still friends, and it was a bickering between pals, and they understood what it was about, the public didn't. But he could have had the foresight to know that readers of the NME or the Melody Maker letters page wouldn't necessarily know the nuances of his relationship with Paul, and would take it at face value and genuinely see him as the villain of the piece, which he did. For some folk, he hasn't recovered from, really. For most people, he has, but that became the received wisdom, didn't it?
Yeah, and you get that perpetuated in Rolling Stone over and over again. And you get it, the Philip Norman book, Shout, that's the narrative, isn't it? Like, you basically calls the bad guy in the piece, and John Lennon is 3/4 of the Beatles, or whatever it is he said. And loads of that book now, if you read proper historians on that book, they're like, you can't trust a word of it, really. But it still makes lists of the best Beatles books, and there are still people that repeat stuff that's in that book that has been proven to not be true. And another thing that's interesting, I suppose, is that I guess Paul is aware of that, but I guess out of respect for John Lennon, he doesn't really push back against it very often until quite a long time has passed. And then we're talking in the 90s, where he does start to raise it in interviews. It's a big theme in the Barry Miles book that comes out in 97? And so that's quite interesting as well, like the way he's aware of how he's being portrayed, but kind of biting his tongue for a little while, I feel.
Which is, it's quite admirable, there are aspects of his life that are like this. The relationship with Jane Asher being another one, things that are private.
And both sides on Jane Asher.
On both sides, So he does have he's got a sense of kind of
decorum,
exactly.
Appropriateness.
Yes, indeed.
Privacy.
And when he did start to come,
it can make him hard to write about at times.
I know.
But
that's true, very true. Very true.
You sort of you're concerned if you're writing about Paul McCartney to the extent to which you are projecting things onto him that haven't necessarily been confirmed from the man himself.
And as you say, and he made the point himself, the difference between Sir Paul and Paul McCartney, the person that grew up in Liverpool, and how he and I thought it was a really good, astute point that he knows, and you quoted, he feels at points constrained by Sir Paul McCartney musically, apart from obviously at a human level as well. And in the 90s, he found a way. I mean, as you cite as well, there's ways in the 70s explored that obviously when the Ram instrumental Thrillington came out, none of us knew that was McCartney at the time, and then we know we can add the dots together, and there's always been this experimental Paul trying to get out.
Well, as far back as Pepper, the idea of the invented band, or the kind of front band, to let you do it with a bit more freedom. He's never really ditched that idea, I think, or that desire to get away from himself, sort of.
So
Yeah,
will we turn to the book now?
Just to be mean to John again, you know, people are going, "Oh, he's the experimental one," and
I know. But can
you go, hang on, you know, Yoko's experimental.
She was
experimental. I think John liked experimental people, but I'm not sure how experimental he was himself. That, you know, genuine.
That's true, but I think possibly he had an adventurous spirit. He was maybe too lazy and too cynical to originally to go seek out the avant-garde himself, and had I think he'd received a bit of snobbery at art school and probably was still a bit resentful of that. But I think his spirit of invention, I think if Paul McCartney had been in a band with Jerry Marsden, for example, no disrespect to him, but if he has an intellectual side, he's kept it quite well concealed. Paul might not have gotten into John Cage and Stockhausen and things like that. So even if John wasn't the instigator in literal terms, the kind of spirit that he generated within that group meant it was fine for Paul to do that if he so desired.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And there's a group alchemy going on here as well. There's
always.
What is that? I always forget how to pronounce. What's the Brian Eno word about the collective genius?
I don't know.
Cineus or something. Brian Eno invented a word that genius is never really completely individual. It's about context and collaboration, and he uses example the Bowie Berlin trilogy album. It's not just about Bowie, it's about Berlin, it's about Eno and etc. Tony Visconti, and I think it's really a good idea. That it seldom is. There's context. There's the others around. They had this community around them. It's George Martin, Brian Epstein, people like Mal Evans, etc.
Yes,
all
Yeah, and George and Ringo, lest we forget,
of course,
with their own realms of experimentation. Yeah. So yes, shall we get on to the 90s then? We've that was the background. We've acknowledged Paul's kind of cultural standing. Has gone up and down. But
actually, you raised an important point about he's not played live as well in the 80s, so he's kind of like off the boards and not in front of audiences, and that probably makes a difference. And there's give my regards to Broad Street as well, which gets an absolute
yeah. And then people cite the Frog Chorus, which is actually I say this to everyone that says this, because it's such a cited thing. Is that I like the Frog Chorus because you know, we all know where it comes from. It comes from a children's film, etc. It was sort of an accidental hit single and everything. You know?
I'll defend that one to the death, because it came out when I was the target audience, so I thought that was great. And I could show you a video of 200 Kirkcudbright Primary School children singing a version of it arranged and worked out by me and them, and it was magnificent. It's still a beautiful children's song.
You know, it's a children's song for children from a cartoon. Does it succeed on that level? Massively.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
I think there's the low point. I mean, I don't mind the album Broad Street, but obviously you can't make a great case for it. But then you've got Spies Like Us, you know, which is again it's got a tune in it, but the production is just so clunky and bad. And then there's Press to Play, which again has got stuff in it that's really interesting. But again, I mean, I was just saying earlier that I was trying to list it in the last year, you know, to reclaim it again, thinking I know there's good stuff, but you can't really get past. The production is so difficult to get past.
Yeah, and he is a reactive artist.
Yeah,
and he always has been. But that was another thing about not remembering who he is really, and then going through all these different producers and really trying to get those gated snares and all that 80s and the synthy stuff. Sometimes good. I mean, he was a bit of a synth pioneer really with McCartney too, but then he jumped from the cool experimental stuff to the fairly cheesy stuff. And then suddenly in the 90s, maybe thanks to Elvis Costello and others, remembered he's a guitarist in a band, and that is actually what he's really, really good at. And so
but that thing also about chasing hits, you know, that some people, once you've had lots of hits, you want to be still in the charts, you want to be contemporary. And you know, an example similar would be, I mean, I'm a huge Frank Sinatra fan, and Frank's, you know, some of Frank's the 50s music, but some of the reprise stuff. But in the 60s, he's constantly chasing hits and trying to be contemporary and diluting his art. So, you know, That's Life, My Way, a song he hates, you know, that defines him for a generation. And I guess McCartney, as the charts are changing, is trying to chase hits and be contemporary. And he's getting, as you know, less and less hits from the mid-80s onwards. Eventually stopped some hit singles, like a whole generation of them. So
which brings us to...
I was just going to say, you know, he's he's a music maker, he's not a filmmaker. That's why
That's very
in that
true.
regards doesn't work. I think he seems to think you can put films together in a similar way to putting an album together.
That's right.
Which for him is often to work quite quickly, and have an idea on some bit of paper, and then
That's right.
that can be a film, and that's not how you make films.
It wasn't his
That's
first
how
go at
few
it though either, was it?
That's right.
films are made.
Yeah,
Well, that's
Magical Mystery Tour was again the same thing.
Yeah.
Just we'll draw a circle. There we go. That's the plot.
But he sort of makes the case for Magical Mystery Tour now, and because of things like, you know, how the 60s come all full round, like the way that the monkey's head is, like, you know, reclaimed by some folk, he didn't learn his lesson enough with Magical Mystery. And let's say the plus side of Broads, he's learned his lesson.
Yeah. So far. Maybe it's your sequel.
I think it's kind of a surrogate for not performing live, because there's a lot of kind of playing live in the film, and it feels almost like it's like a long music video rather than a film. Only it's cost a lot of money, and it's been put in cinemas, and then no one's gone to see it, and etc. etc. That's critical for taking it too seriously, to an extent.
Yeah, I've only seen this film. I was you know, as you can convey, I have been a Paul McCartney fanatic at points in my life, and it's been a lonesome journey sometimes. And even hiding my Wings albums when I was a kid, when people came around, you know, I seriously hid them under the bed, and I'm just trying to pass on that shameful moment in my life. But there's something about, you know, when did Paul McCartney become cool? It's such a fascinating subject, because we have walked this path. And when did you first think of writing this book, JR? What was it that brought you to this subject?
Well, yeah, it was right. It was working on the previous one, as I said before, and just kind of thinking a bit harder about Paul McCartney in different parts of his career. I mean, you know, I did not rebel against my parents in the respect that they were into the Beatles, and I was sort of raised on them among other things. My dad has this had this cassette. One half of it was the best of the Police, on, you know, one half of the 45 cassette, and on the other half, on the other side, was his edit of the White Album, where he just got, it was like the best of the White Album, all the songs that he liked, with none of the songs that he didn't like, which was most of kind of the early stuff rather than later tracks, I guess. So that's quite amusing, because that was my White Album for a bit, and then I didn't, you know, I got this like the double CD when I was at university, I think, and it was like getting the like deluxe bonus edition, because it's suddenly these tracks that I was totally new to, because my dad had rejected them, and
brilliant.
And so yeah, it was extra Beatles material there, and he used to play Beatles songs on the piano and stuff and that kind of thing. So yeah, and you know, coming of age in the 90s, and being into grunge and Britpop and that kind of stuff, and both those scenes, I think, help the Beatles become more credible after people were hiding their Wings albums under their beds in earlier time.
But even having said that, I remember Liam Gallagher, he of the brilliant witticism, saying he'd rather be a dead Lennon than a live McCartney.
God. Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh, I only remember that because Noel Gallagher brought it up in an interview as a demonstration of what an arsehole his brother was. But you know, that for someone who's in a band that self-proclaimed heavily influenced by the Beatles, to still think it's acceptable to separate one half of them to a figure of fun, it's bizarre. It shows how overbearing that public view has been.
Yeah,
it's mad how little Oasis share with the Beatles in terms of
100%.
What would you, in terms of, what would you call it? Kind of ambition and
spirit,
creativity,
evolution. You know, everything.
Yeah. Although what they did do that the Beatles did as well was they burst onto an establishment where working class voices were fairly rare, and they communicated extremely effectively and very directly with folk who maybe hadn't been getting communicated to by cleverer, smarter bands like Blur and Pulp and things.
That's true. That's true. And there was a kind of Oasis mania, and you could even say this. You wouldn't call it Oasis mania now, but there's something with the reunion tour, etc.
They touched a lot of people.
They did. But I mean, I'm saying it's in no way being snide about this band, because they've said it themselves. The obvious big link of Oasis inspiration is Slade, and Slade. They were anthemic. There's a simplicity in the melodies, but there's a brilliance, and working class voices as well. And a deliberate misspelling of titles and everything going on, just wonderful.
And similar consistency of sound, I think, which the Beatles didn't aspire to and were brilliantly avoided.
But also humour's in Slade, which is clearly missing from large part of Oasis.
Large parts.
Yeah, I'm a bit annoyed about Oasis.
Yeah.
In the book, I got a bit, moaning about Oasis and that kind of thing, and then going, the big difference is that the Beatles are for every generation, whereas Oasis is very much of their time. And then as soon as it's published, Oasis decide to reform, and there's like 12-year-olds paying 200 quid a ticket and stuff. I'm thinking, no.
I don't think it detracts from your thesis, actually.
Oh, good.
No, because having read it when it came out, then reading it, bits of it I think it stands still. There's that period that there's, as you were saying, exactly. Britpop was an explosion with loads of great music in it, as well as there's a retro culture going on that has obviously been talked about, and it's looking backward part of time, whereas the 60s and the Beatles, the Stones, etc., they're looking forward. It's expansive. It's the horizons, and so they're entirely different phenomenon.
Yeah, so Oasis are going, we're the new Beatles. Beatles are great. Beatles. I know. Which perpetuates, in the press and in their interviews. And then sort of young listeners who perhaps aren't familiar with the Beatles, they buy the anthology or whatever, and they realise how much better the Beatles are than Oasis, and they reject Oasis, and there's suddenly like listening to Tomorrow Never Knows and going, this sounds like the Chemical Brothers,
Yeah,
that's right.
But I was already listening to the Beatles when Britpop hit, so I already liked them. But that was definitely the case for me and the Kinks, who I hadn't really known. But I think Damon Albarn was particularly effusive about Ray Davies.
That's true.
And I think I had a best of, but I didn't start looking at their albums until those 90s bands kind of directed people back, and they were quite good at that. And the like Q magazine and Mojo and things were quite onto that as well, including fairly fatuous attempts to compare individual 90s bands with individual 60s ones, so that Cast are the small faces of the 90s and Pulp are the zombies of the 90s, as if that could ever be meaningful, but entertaining, all good fun.
Yeah. So, Ger, what have you been trying to do with the Paul McCartney book? What was it you set out to do to explore Paul McCartney's coming back into being viewed as cool, which with all the connotations that means? What was this an attempt to do to reclaim Paul?
It just felt like the more I read about it and the more I thought about it, it felt to me like I could make a convincing case that the 90s was the most significant decade for him and his career and his credibility after the 1960s. You might say the 1970s were just as important. But as I say, it's not just because of what he's doing, although he gets all these kinds of new ideas going and everything, but also it's to do with what's going on around him, and as we've said, Britpop bands championing the Beatles as an influence. The anthology campaign kind of boosts the Beatles brand, obviously, massively, perhaps more than anyone was expecting. And as you've said as well, he kind of as you put it, he sort of rediscovers what he's about and what he's for and what he's good at. I think there's a sense that he like you were talking about chasing hits, he relaxes a bit, doesn't he? And he's perhaps can be at his best when he's at his more relaxed. I've got this thread of like kind of running through it, like in some ways he's caring a lot less, but in certain ways he's caring more. So he's caring more about reputation again, as I was saying, versus Lennon as the edgy experimental one. He's caring less in terms of production, as we've kind of touched on as well, like the 80s albums, as you said, armies of producers with synth sounds and snare sounds or whatever, too many cooks. The Off the Ground album is not my favourite Paul McCartney solo album, but it's significant in that it's recorded with his live band pretty quickly. Not many takes. It's it's not a grunge album exactly, but it's kind of and I won't go into that digression. But there's maybe grunge made the Beatles cool before Britpop to a certain extent. So on Off the Ground, he's much more relaxed about recording, get the songs down, put them out kind of attitude. But in terms of caring a bit more, the care a bit more side, it's the lyrics that time. He gets them read by the poet Adrian Mitchell to check that they are what he calls poet proof. I don't know whether Adrian Mitchell just sort of nodded and said, yes, they're great, Paul.
Paul McCartney, will you sign my photo?
And Flaming Pie is similar because that's recorded almost like the McCartney 1 and 2 solo albums, although Jeff Lynne and Steve Miller pop up and Ringo and stuff. But a lot of it's him on his own in the studio, bashing stuff out. And he's working very quickly again. And he talks about how, I don't know how much this is spin, but he talks about how the anthology reminded him how quickly the Beatles worked. And they, do 3 amazing songs in one day. And he's doing working similarly quickly to that. But at the same time, like the Beatles, he doesn't want there to be any filler on Flaming Pie. He wants it to be again, you could question whether he achieves it or not, but he doesn't want any filler. He wants to be great song, great song, great song, great song, great song, blah, 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 end of album. So I think that's that kind of works for him, doesn't it? Not overthinking too much.
Yeah, I listen
with movies, but it works with albums.
I actually listened to not Flaming Pie, Off the Ground properly for the first time this morning in preparation for me speaking to you, and decided to do it. Well, no, I must have dipped into it when I was reading your book because it'd be hard not to, but to go back to it and just sit down, and decided to do it totally unjudgmentally, because even as a fan, it would have been out of the question for me to buy that when it came out. Buying a new Paul McCartney album in the early 90s, just don't be ridiculous. But I did buy Flaming Pie when it came out, which I don't know if that's just because of my musical journey or because by that point, oh no, it's actually newsworthy now. McCartney, that guy from that TV show you've been watching about the Beatles, he's got a new one out. But actually listening to it this morning, I really, really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really solid piece of work. And if listeners or viewers haven't dipped in, give it a bash, because it's incredibly accomplished songwriting. And there's a couple of the Elvis Costello co-writes in there, which had definitely lifted his game in terms of not just falling back on tried and tested stuff, I think. And it's got a unity of sound, as you say, and the band are pretty tight, and they do sound like they're enjoying themselves. I enjoyed it. I might listen to it again, in fact.
I'm going to listen to it again. Because I've always had issues with it. I mean, I've never, to me, the lazy lyrics of Biker Like an Icon, and the dreadful cover, which is one of his worst covers, when there's been many wonderful Paul McCartney album covers. But I will give it another spin again, because I have been thinking about it. I know.
There is, yes.
There is.
It doesn't make you want to. It doesn't really make you want to grab it off the shelf.
No, it doesn't.
I was talking to someone on another podcast, and they were remembering that Paul McCartney, they were saying they've been into their local, when it came out, their HMV or R Price or whatever, to buy the new Paul McCartney album Off the Ground, on the week of release. They said they'd have to order it in. Can you imagine Paul McCartney releasing an album and it not being in the high street record shop?
Yeah.
Anyway, but Flaming Pie was everywhere.
That's right.
I wonder, actually, you mentioned that the 70s could have a claim to being that kind of most significant post-60s decade, but the headwind he had behind him in the 70s must have made, even though there was the critical backlash, but we know that 90% of music fans probably don't read reviews, just like 90% of voters don't watch the news, I would guess. Oh, there's a lyric there, isn't? Anyway, but
You're trying to be topical.
so, but by the 90s, he didn't have that headwind anymore. So trying to reestablish himself is, in a way, even more impressive after a genuine decade in the wilderness, almost, or several years in the wilderness, than still being Beatle Paul in a lot of people's minds. The capital they had from that, and George spoke about that too. You know, a lot of people, there was a lot of goodwill which they all benefited from. But that had largely maybe gone by the 90s, and he had to work to get it back again, or wait for the culture to get suitably nostalgic or whatever it was.
Because your point, Alan, is he was kind of written off, wasn't he? I mean, I know it sounds bizarre to say it, but he was kind of written off. He was even written off in the 70s, and then there's this thing which you just didn't talk. Like I was saying, you didn't talk about liking Wings, you didn't talk about liking Paul McCartney, or you did it in an apologetic way.
You're quite scarred by this, aren't you?
I am. It's my major therapy. It's my major therapy issue.
I wonder if any of your ex-schoolmates are watching this and going, I knew he was a Wings fan.
I know.
I
am actually quite proud of it, because it's when I come to, as I was saying, late 70s, you know, when punk and new wave that I loved. And when I bought Ram, for example, and you bought albums that you'd never heard because it wasn't getting radio play and so on. And so you come to it with all these terrible reviews, and I'm thinking, this is genius. It's just like filled with like an abundance of ideas and melodies. And then even when I played Wildlife first time, I thought it's not the classic, obviously, but it's still very interesting and tuneful in places. And so I kind of in a way quite liked it at the same time as, you know, it's like you like your own little secret loves, you know.
Yes.
So scarred and not scarred.
Yeah. Guilty pleasure.
Exactly.
We're not supposed to have guilty pleasures anymore.
No, I know.
We're post guilty pleasure, so
I know.
No one hides. Well, no one has any record collection to hide anymore, but they won't be hiding their playlists.
No, hope not.
Yeah.
Did you know when you started writing the book? I guess you will obviously have revisited the 90s material, but had you been listening to it at the time? Were you a fan when it was coming out, or had it passed? Had passed you by?
I hadn't got off the ground at the time. I think I had Flaming Pie when that came out. And I remember he did lots of kind of TV appearances and stuff at that time, didn't he? Remember him kind of sort of popping up and being back and that kind of
TFI thing. Friday and that sort of thing. Yeah,
that's right.
Shows. Yeah,
that's really interesting. Have you watched that interview?
I saw it at the time. I can't remember it terribly clearly.
It's really interesting, because I have this stuff in the book about how he kind of keeps Britpop at arm's length as well, quite wisely. Like he's not, you know, behind Oasis doing his thumbs up or going into the studio with them every day or anything like that. And I think there's various reasons why that might be. But yeah, and I don't think he's particularly into like Cool Britannia flag waving kind of stuff, from what I can tell. And so it's like a kind of uneasy interview, the TFI Friday one. It warms up a bit, but he's quite like, you know, not taking much of Chris Evans' bollocks, really. You know,
good for him.
At one point, Chris Evans says something like, "George Harrison, he's a bit weird, isn't he?" And Paul's just like, "No, he's my friend or whatever." Defends him. You know, and it just, what a strange question. But anyway, and then another weird thing of that, like, one of the questions is what modern young bands are you listening to? And Paul McCartney says Nirvana, and it's 1997, so it's quite a few years after Kurt Cobain has passed away violently. So, and I think you could read that as he's, you know, out of touch again, because he's talking about a grunge band when we're in 1997 and grunge is dead or whatever. But I wonder whether there is a sense to it in that he kind of does like grunge more than Britpop. I know James McCartney was a fan of Nirvana. I wonder whether he sees parallels between John Lennon and Kurt Cobain, maybe. That
I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure. I also think that the band, all four of them, their musical loyalty was American, really. Their early influences came from the States. They were very effusive about the bands that influenced them, and open about the fact that, you know, the being in Liverpool and having the music coming across to the docks. So he maybe just genuinely likes American music better than British music, or British music's not necessarily his first touchstone at any given time.
That could be right, yeah. And as I say, Off the Ground is hardly a grunge album, but it is alive in the studio with the live band album, which is kind of the ethos of the production style that had come back into favour thanks to grunge.
Yeah.
And of course, he didn't just do in the 90s his pop albums, those 2 studio albums.
Right.
He had an awful lot, which you cover very well in the book,
Yeah.
of sort of side ventures, some of which were originally intended to be another example of him kind of hiding behind a new persona, and some are classical, so going to brand new genres. And did he also open LIP, the Liverpool Institute in the 90s? Was that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So,
and exhibiting abstract paintings as well.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Doing.
Shall we talk about the
Yes.
fireman for a minute? Yeah.
I mean, because in many years from now, he's saying that I was the experimental Beatle, or one of the experimental Beatles, and haven't quite got credit for that. Also in the 90s, he starts releasing quite experimental music separately, not again, which is quite interesting. When I told people I was writing a book about Paul McCartney in the 90s, they kind of stare at me for a few seconds and go, "What did he do in the 90s?" And then I'd be like, "Well, he did this and he did this and he did that and he did that." Yeah, and one of the things is the classical stuff, which it does all right commercially, but I don't think it's regarded particularly highly by classical music critics. I'm not a classical music buff, so I can't really gauge whether it succeeds on that level or not.
Likewise, but having tried, I think I've tried them all at one time or another. I don't think I've gone back to any of them a second time, but I'm
me too.
Perfectly glad that he made them, in that they add to the whole picture of his inventive and curiosity of nature.
And listening to a very small amount of classical contemporary work, let's say Max Richter, is and various others. There's just nothing like unique in it or memorable. It seems, I don't know, it seems like a bland copy in a way to me.
Well, I think he likes the sonic textures of orchestral music and always has done, but his previous use of it has been to augment a song, and the song is where his particular genius lies. And if you take the actual central seed of the song away, maybe what's left is less impressive, but perfectly pleasant all the same.
Well, talking of textures, that's kind of what the Fireman is all about.
Yeah.
That's another interesting thing, because that comes out of Off the Ground, and although, as I was saying, Off the Ground is a sort of ragged live in the studio kind of album, the Fireman evolves out of there because he asks Youth to remix some of the songs for 12-inch single releases, which is kind of a continuation of what he was doing with the previous album and stuff, and then that kind of spills over into the first record that becomes the first record by the Fireman, which is him and Youth working together, making kind of how would you describe it, sort of abstract, dancey, arty techno stuff,
sound collage kind of, and very tech driven and quite free form. Although I think Youth is largely, his role seems to be kind of harnessing McCartney's endless scattergun of ideas and getting them looped so that there's a structure going on. But it does sound like they're having an absolute whale of a time.
And very, very contemporary of the 90s, of all sorts of cutting edge left field bands,
apparently he didn't want anyone to know it was them, and they did it all secretly and released it as the Fireman without their names on the sleeve and that kind of thing. But for whatever reason, the information did get leaked.
Yes, inevitably. But it makes you wonder if there are any secret projects he's managed to keep secret out there that we've all.
It does. Wouldn't it be fantastic if we found that some of those Aphex Twin aliases are
yeah, that'd be great.
Paul McCartney.
It was Paul all along.
That would be the ultimate liberation and trick on us, wouldn't it? In today's saturated culture, like when the Residents had that thing about nobody's meant to know who the Residents are. How much is it possible to pull us off in today's age?
Are you suggesting that Paul McCartney was in the Residents?
Yep, maybe.
Yep.
We don't know he wasn't.
We don't. We can't say for sure.
That's true. Yeah.
But see, those albums, the Fireman, the first 2 albums, they went over my head at the time. What was that the same with both of you?
I came to them later,
Me too.
and I've quite enjoyed them. But because I don't think because in the 90s, like a lot of folk who were getting back into the Beatles, it was because of a love of guitar bands, guitar, bass, drums, a couple of singers, and mainly a bunch of mates. That it was that kind of paradigm that really appealed to me, and still does, I have to say. And so I probably wouldn't have gone in for that. But listening to it in retrospect, I've thoroughly enjoyed them.
Oh, yeah, me too.
A couple of people have said to me like they didn't know anything about it until they read the book, and they've
well, mission accomplished then for Paul.
Just discovered it through that, which is really nice, because I guess if you know a lot about Paul McCartney, you assume everybody knows that he had this weird dance project, but they don't. Yeah, and I guess the third Fireman album, when was that, in the sort of 2000s? That was a bit more, bit more promoted, wasn't it? A bit more full on. And he sang on it a lot more. So I thought people would know about it from that, but no, people are still finding it, and the Rushes album, which is particularly strong, I think.
I suppose another one a bit like that could be the McClure album, which is
I was going to say,
almost entirely a Paul and Wings album that people don't know about because they don't recognize, they don't know it's him behind it.
Because we now know if you join these dots, there's the whole secret Paul McCartney. Because you're saying there's McClure album, there's Thrillington, there's Holidays of Denny, Paul, and Linda.
Red Stripes, Susie and the Red Stripes.
But some people say the Holidays album was how Paul, sort of the ramshackle way Paul originally envisaged Wings before, or how they started before it became, not sure that's right, but it's charming and could have been promoted properly. I mean, it didn't sell any at the time,
Well, going back to the classical thing, I think one thing I particularly like about it, not from the musical point of view, because as we've discussed, we're maybe not entirely qualified to recognize how successful that was, but from an indication of where he was personally with his confidence and what he felt he could do, that does speak of a kind of, do you know what? I just will have a go at this. And I've been pilloried for being a bit too establishment and a bit too nicey nice and all that kind of stuff. And he did spend the 80s trying to please the critics and failing at every turn, and some of the 70s. So, I love the fact that he does these things, and they do all, now that we're looking at an 83-year-old man now, we've got, I do hope there's many more years ahead of him, but we've got the bulk of the man's career behind them. We can start to look at it as a whole, and those definitely do add to it as a whole in terms of how impressive it is.
Yeah.
I think people find it difficult to believe his sincerity, though, with some of these things, because he is so varied. If you can do a 2-minute rock and roll number just as convincingly as you can do an oratoria, well, which one is it that you actually mean?
That's right.
But that's to misunderstand him, I think.
That's right. That was one of the dominant critiques I remember in 70s rock press, beginning into the 80s. It was like, the chameleon nature of Paul McCartney was like, he has many voices and personas, and like what he's trying to somehow trick us in a way.
Where's the authenticity?
Where John Lennon has the one authentic rock and roll voice, and I must admit, because it was so prevalent, you sort of bought into it a bit. I'm thinking that's right. Look at all these different tracks, even on Wings albums, style wise, and there's a little bit of that can be a bit annoying. Like, I don't think Baby's Request is the best way to end Back to the Egg, but these are small verses, just this sheer drive of innovation and taking chances. And I just look at it now with audacity. There's practically nobody else comparable post the 60s like this.
Yeah, I almost wish that he had done what Dylan kind of did with Self-Portrait and actually overtly said, "This is a big fuck off to my fans." But he's never done that, and he probably has never really intentionally produced a big fuck off to his fans. So excuse language, by the way, folks. I'm quoting Rolling Stone, a noble source. Oh no, the Rolling Stone review was, "What is this shit?" Isn't it? For Self-Portrait, which they've said the same about a lot of McCartney in so many words. But he's true to his own unique artistic vision, and then he sort of unfortunately regrets it when it doesn't land, or regrets it when it's sneered at. And it would be much better for him personally if he could just go, well, I had fun doing it. I did, it occurred to me and I did it. And what are you going to do about it? Where's your album? He does a bit of that, but not enough, I think. He's still quite defensive about it.
He was affected. We can tell by the trajectory. He is affected by, all these terrible reviews. And it's like the road not traveled. Clearly, like Ram, just one example, is because of the invective thrown on it. It's a road not taken. Now, maybe Wings still's happened, which is fine, and all that. But that sheer just like embracing of genius and imagination. And okay, some of those lyrics don't mean anything, but Who cares?
Some of Dylan's lyrics don't mean anything. Let's be honest, but they sound good.
Yeah,
you know, they're impressive, rhythmically impressive. McCartney has a great a great knowledge of the rhythm of words.
Yes, that's
and
true.
he's not a literal lyricist particularly, and he's not. Although, as you say, in the 90s, it's certainly not off the ground. I got the sense he was trying to write from a writerly place, but when he's going from a more intuitive place, he goes with the sound and what sounds good, and then leaves it to the listener to kind of draw connections and see if there's any meaning in there, and often get it wrong, I think.
Yeah.
Have you got a flaming pie? Sorry.
Yeah. Have you got, JR, just as I'm not talking about like your favorite McCartney album or but have you got a kind of deep cut, or one that's a kind of special place in your heart that
a song or an album?
Oh, an album, then you can take it to a song or whatever,
I mean, one I discovered relatively late in my life was McCartney 2. I don't know when it was that I first heard that, but I hadn't. I mean, again, that didn't have a great reputation for a long while, did it?
No.
And I remember just having I don't remember when it was, but I remember the experience of having my mind absolutely blown by Temporary Secretary.
Oh, yes.
And the sounds in that, which he made all analog, didn't he? But it sounds like a mad dance track from the 90s, maybe, or later, I don't know. And honestly, still, whenever I hear Temporary Secretary, and I know people don't like the lyrics particularly or whatever, or they think it's a bibbly-bobbly novelty song, it just makes me smile every time I hear it, and I hear a new noise perhaps when I put it on, or notice different parts of the composition and things. And that was an absolute joy to discover that, whenever the hell that was.
And I'm 100% sure that making you smile was his whole intention. That was it. That was the purpose of that.
Oh, yeah, and that's
yeah.
I mean, he probably prefers to make people smile than tell them to fuck off. As you want him
to. He does.
I mean, Coming Up. I mean, when Coming Up came up, I didn't quite like it. Just being honestly, because it was a shift in style, from the Wings era and all that. Even though there's all the shifts in the Wings era, and of course, to me, looking at it now, it's just like I thought, why did I not like that initially? It's just genius. It's aged brilliantly. The video's hilarious, and then of course, there's what McCartney 2 could have been with. It takes till the 93 reissues of that series, is it McCartney collection of CDs, and they put Check Your Machine, Check My Machine, and Secret Friend on. I'm thinking these are just like amazingly. These are cutting edge kind of musical instrumental innovations of if there's some contemporary classical person or something dabbling would be.
And again, he backs off from it, doesn't he?
Does.
Imagine if he just carried on that path for the 80s. It would have been
much more interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we've got in the last few minutes, JR, and before we do finish off, thank you very much again for joining us.
Thank you.
Shall we see how, because you've mentioned the fact that in the 90s he was very keen to reclaim his position as the experimental Beatle, or the one who was active in the underground in the 60s and not just viewing it from a distance. He was right there at the performances and things, and joining in and producing experimental movies and tape loops and things himself. Do we buy into the fact that he actually was the experimental Beatle? How do we rate Paul's involvement with the avant-garde or with experimental art compared to John's, who is in most people's mind more overtly from the artistic background, the art school background?
I think he makes a convincing case in many years from now that he was hanging out with William Burroughs and people, and going to crazy exhibition openings and playing around with tape loops in Jane Asher's house when John was in the suburbs with Cynthia, watching too much television and getting really fed up. I think, I do buy that. I mean, I know he's also, I mean, this is it. We're talking about the breadth of his stuff. He's also the man that can chuck out an amazing ballad about his wife that's, that appeals to radio too. I'm not going to say he is the experimental Beatle. He's one of the experimental Beatles. And you made a good point earlier about the others allowing each other to experiment, and the group dynamic, which is really important as well. But clearly, as we've said, you know, he doesn't release a string of experimental albums, but there are points all the way along where he's doing kind of strange experimental stuff, whether as an alias or privately or overtly. So I would champion him as one of the experimental Beatles. Is that sitting on the fence?
How about you, Gerry? What you?
Okay, I kind of really agree with that. I love them all, you know. I love them all, and I love the chemistry. And it's like the people view, oh, isn't it terrible they broke up or whatever. I'm just feel blessed to live on the planet at a point where we have this memory of them and relationship with them. I do feel blessed. And if there's a wee caveat, I do think that some of the continued celebration of them is obviously about them. But the lack of musical innovation, like now, where is the music of the future? I always keep trying to find, you know, and you can find bits of it, you know, but there's not enough cutting edge stuff in the way the 60s, but you know, the whole host things, culture, technology, youthful generation, you know. But what about you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly, there's no denying that he was the one who was active and visible. I wonder if the reason why it hasn't stuck is because his use of the avant-garde, or his use of experimental music styles and things, music concrete and things like that, was not to shock people out of their complacency, which maybe its original intention was. It was to go to the general public and say, hey, this is quite cool, you might enjoy this as well, which is much more generous, but it's also much more showbiz and less rock and roll. I mean, I love him for it. I love the fact that Revolution, what's it called? For goodness sake, last one on Revolver, Tomorrow Never Knows, is a piece of avant-garde composition as well as a song, but it's wrapped up. First of all, it's at the end of a flawless pop album, and it's with those familiar pop voices that we have there. I think if people had known at the time that although it's John's voice, actually the mind-blowing sounds in the background are Paul's idea, and he's the one that led all that. It maybe the song wouldn't have been regarded as quite as revolutionary. But, so McCartney's doing that. All right, well, I don't know. So I think it's an unfair assessment, but it's unfair to disregard his contribution. But I think I understand maybe why John's use was seen as more in keeping with maybe some of the original intentions of people like Fluxus and some of the other experimental artists.
I suppose people then, because they're aiding the invention, not on their own, of rock criticism and rock studies, you know, there was less like talking about how you do the process. You know, so if that music of the future, if it had been 10 years later talking about it, there'd been more a way of talking about the process of perhaps.
Possibly so.
Yeah, and forums for doing it. They were yet to be invented, and they helped invent them.
Yes, indeed, of course. What a responsibility. What a responsibility. Well, is that a good place for us to wind up, folks? That seems like that's been lovely. I think we've covered about 3% of what we could have done. So that's
that's the way it goes, isn't it? Yeah,
it is indeed. But thanks, JR, for joining us. It's a pleasure to meet you, and thanks for a brilliant book. And folks, do give JR's book a read. It's well worth it. It's fantastically readable, even if you're not that keen on that period of Paul's music. If you're interested in him as a cultural character or just as a man, then it's worth a read.
Yes, called Off the Ground, Paul McCartney in the 1990s, and available from all good bookshops and some places on the internet.
Yes, indeed.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, JR.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure to see you.
Bye. Take care, folks. Bye. Right, great. So, thanks, folks. See you next time.